This is part 2 of chapter 2. It will begin at the section entitled The Four Sensations of Time and run to the end of the chapter, and this is about 45 minutes. Ethnos and the Four Sensations of Time. What is time? No one knows, but people have learned to measure it. Even the most primitive peoples, who have no need of a linear reckoning of time from some arbitrary date, such as the founding of Rome, the creation, the birth of Christ, the Hegira, which is Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina, etc., distinguish day and night, the seasons, a living chronology, according to the dates of their own life, and finally, cyclicity, i.e. the week, month, 12 years, each of which bears the name of an animal, the Turco-Mongolian calendar. The linear reckoning of time, as comparative ethnography has shown, develops when an ethnos begins to feel its history not as something exclusive, but in connection with the history of neighboring countries. And as knowledge accumulates, a quantification of time arises in people's consciousness, i.e., its division into epochs or ages, very unequal in length, but equivalent as regards content of events. The category of time clashes here with the category of force, i.e., the cause stimulating acceleration, in the special case of the historical process. Such a diversity of systems indicates that it responds to serious changes in the consciousness of an ethnos itself, which indicates in turn a change of its ages. For my purpose, the system of reckoning is not important, but rather the difference in concepts of past, present, and future. When an ethnic community enters on the first creative period of its becoming, the leading part of its population, pushing the whole system along the path of ethnic development, amasses material and ideological values. This accumulation becomes an imperative in the field of ethics and is transformed, as regards time, into a feeling the sense of which is that each active builder of the ethnic entity feels himself a continuer of the ancestral line, to which he adds something, another victory, another building, another copied manuscript, another forged sword. This other suggests that the past has not gone, but is in him, in the person, and it therefore behooves him to add whatever is new, because the past is thus accumulated and advanced. Each minute lived is perceived as an addition to the existing past. Passu existente. A result of this perception of time is the feats of heroes who have voluntarily laid down their lives for the fatherland. The Spartan Basileus Leonidas at Thermopylae, the consul Marcus Attilius Regulus at Carthage, Roland at the pass of the Roncesvalles, this being equally applicable to the historical count of the Breton marches and the literary hero of the Song of Roland. Such too were the warrior monks, Peresfit and Oslabva, who served with Saint Sergius of Radonez and died in the Battle of Kulikovo, and the great warrior Kadak Batur, who diverted Genghis Khan's troops onto himself so as to let his natural Khan escape. In Europe, people of that type build the Gothic cathedrals without perpetuating their names. In India, they carved the marvelous statues in the cave temples. In Egypt, they built the pyramids. In Polynesia, they discovered America and brought back to their fellow countrymen the kumara, the batata or sweet potato. An absence of personal interest is characteristic of them. They seem to have loved their cause or work more than they loved themselves. But it was not altruism. The object of their love was in themselves, but not just in themselves. They felt themselves not simply the heirs of great traditions, but also participants in them, and gave their dear lives for them in an hour, as in war, or in everyday work, as builders and architects. They acted in accordance with their neuropsychophysical stamp, and the determinate vector and character of their activity. People of that stamp are encountered in all epochs, but there are rather more of them in the initial stages of ethnogenesis than in other stages. As soon as the proportion of them diminishes, a time sets in that we are accustomed to call flourishing, which should more correctly be called squandering. Thought of the past is replaced by actualism. People of that stamp forget the past and do not want to know the future. They want to live now and for themselves. They are courageous, energetic, talented, but what they do for their own sake. They too perform feats, but for the sake of their own greed. They strive for the highest positions in order to enjoy their power, because only the present is real for them, which they inevitably understand as their personal present. Such were Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla in Rome, Alcibiades in Athens, the Prince of Condé, Louis XIV, and Napoleon in France, Iwan the Terrible in Russia, the Sui Emperor Yangdi in China, AD 605 to 618. But it is impossible even to list the writers, artists, professors, etc., who sometimes perform grandiose feats only in order to glorify their names. But such too are the gay rakes, bon vivants, and wastrels. They also live for today and for themselves. When the percentage of people of this stamp in an ethnos increases, the heritage accumulated by their sacrificing ancestors is rapidly squandered, which creates a false impression of abundance, and which is why it is called flourishing. The reader may get an opinion that I condemn people of that mold. No, their perception of time is as legitimate a phenomenon as that described above, and does not depend on their wishes, but on the peculiarities of higher nervous activity. They could not be otherwise even if they wanted to. The famous maxims, "every dog has his day," and "after me the deluge," were not cynicism but sincerity, and the presence of people of this stamp in an ethnos leads not to its disappearance, but only to a cessation of growth, which is sometimes even expedient, because these people, while doing no harm to themselves, do not make it their aim to inflict sacrifices on their neighbors, and the striving for an unlimited expansion of the ethnic territory is replaced by fixing natural frontiers. A third possible and really existing variant of the attitude to time and the world is an ignoring not only of the past but also of the present for the sake of the future. The past is rejected as disappeared, the present as unacceptable, and only the dream is recognized as real. The clearest examples of this perception of the world are the idealism of Plato in Aeschylus, Jewish Chiliasm in the Roman Empire, and the sectarian movements of a Manichaean, Albigensian, and Marcionite, Bogomil, Hugh. The Arab Caliphate, too, did not escape the futurist effect, as it is most correctly called, when, from the 9th century A.D., the Bedouins of Bahrain adopted the Carmathian ideological system and spread through Egypt, Syria, and Iran. The Carmathians established a dynasty, the Fatimids in Egypt, seized the mountain fortresses in Iran, Alamut, Girdakuh, and Lumbasar, from which they dictated their will to Muslim sultans and emirs. The Persians called them Ismailites, and the Crusaders called them assassins. The ideology of the Carmathians was frankly idealistic, but not religious. According to their teaching, the world consisted of two halves, mirror reflections of each other. In this world it was bad for them, the Carmathians. They were oppressed, humiliated, and robbed. In the anti-world, everything was the opposite. They, the Carmathians, would oppress, humiliate, and rob Muslims and Christians. One could only pass to the anti-world with the aid of the living God and of the teacher elders appointed by him, to whom it was necessary, of course, to submit and pay money. There was nothing religious in this system. The striving to represent the teaching of the Carmathians as an ideology of struggle of the oppressed against feudal lords reflects only one aspect of the matter, and not the most important one. The Fatimids in Cairo and Hassan Saba in Alamut were exactly the same kind of oppressors of the peasants as their opponents, although they sometimes made use of social contradictions in the interest of their policy. And indeed, Could a band or sect express the interest of the broad masses? In ancient China, however, the futuristic perception of time was manifested in the 3rd century AD that led the people to the uprising of the Yellow Turbans. In addition to the real class contradictions of the later Han Dynasty, AD 25 to 220, Taoist scholars had been expelled from all posts in the state service by Confucianists and forced to earn their living by treating illnesses and forecasting the weather. This wretched existence did not suit them. They created a theory that, quote, the blue sky of violence, unquote, would be succeeded by the, quote, yellow sky of justice, unquote. In fact, the sky turned red from the reflection of spilled blood. In the period of troubles that succeeded the uprising, the population of China fell from 50 million to 7.5 million. It would be frivolous to blame Taoist propaganda alone for all the calamities, since the overwhelming majority of those involved in the events were foreign to any philosophical conceptions. From my angle, it is only important to note the existence of a futuristic perception of the world and its activation with the decline of the backward-looking view, dislodged, as it were, from the life of the people. It is not by chance that the 3rd century AD is considered the age dividing ancient China from medieval China. A new accumulation of values, both ideological and material, began in the 6th century AD under the Sui dynasty, and took shape in a backward-looking trend in the 7th century during the Tang dynasty. Anni Conrad called this phenomenon the Chinese Renaissance, when under the slogan of "Return to the Ancient," a new original culture was created that was opposed to moral decay and to the brutality of the soldier and nomad kingdoms of the epoch called the Five Barbarians. Footnote 9. One might conclude that a futuristic perception of time is encountered so rarely that it is an anomaly. That is wrong. It is as regular as the two others, but operates in an ethnic association so destructively and disastrously that either the ethnos as a whole or the dreamers die, or they declare their dream fulfilled and become actualists, i.e., begin to live like everyone else. The futuristic perception of the world is dangerous for those around only in pure forms and in high concentrations. Mixed with others, it is capable of arousing sympathy. Johann of Leyden in Munster, for example, knew how to fan a high pitch of passions, and the bloodshed inevitably associated with that phenomenon. But contemporary Baptists are narrow-minded, and as such are closer, in the system of classification I have adopted, to bigoted Catholics, Protestants, and atheists than to their own ideological and spiritual forebears. In other words, profession of an idea does not determine attitude to time and is not linked with it. The pattern of futurism is that the presence of people of this stamp starts a process of ethnic disintegration, and since these processes are observed in all periods we have studied, the disappearance of ethnoi is obviously not an accident or a matter of chance, any more than the appearance of new ones is. Both are parts of one and the same dialectical process, ethnogenesis. And if as people we may sympathize with some mental attitude or mentality, as scientists we must simply define the relations and vectors of the constituent magnitudes in the general trend of the movement being studied. Past worship, actualism, and futurism reflect three stages of the ethnic dynamics, but there must be, in addition, and actually is, a frame of reference of the category of time corresponding to the static state of the ethnos. It consists in the very ignoring of time that I have already described. Time does not interest people of this stamp because they derive no benefit from contemplating it for the activity that nourishes them. There are such people, that I called narrow-minded or Philistines above, in all stages, but they are hardly noticed when other categories exist. When all their rivals disappear with the triumph of futurism or obscurantism, indestructible mediocrities emerge from the cracks and fissures. Historical time comes to a halt, and the land lies fallow. So I have closed all the lines of my analysis and obtained confirmation of a hypothesis of a four-member construction of ethnic becoming. That is not a chance coincidence and not an arbitrary construct, but a reflection of the essence of the process of ethnic disintegration. But if my analysis has exhausted the theme, then not only ethnology, but also ethnoi themselves would long ago not have been, because they would have all disintegrated with the passing of historical time. Obviously, there are creative processes of intra-ethnic evolution, in addition to the destructive ones, thanks to which new ethnic associations arise. The ethnic history of mankind therefore does not cease and will not, as long as there are people on earth. Because an ethnos is not an arithmetical sum of human units, but a system, a concept that must be unraveled in detail. Ethnos as a system. System, in a popular explanation. A well-known example of a social system is the family living in one home. The elements of the system are the members of the family and the objects of their way of life. These include the husband, wife, mother-in-law, son, daughter, house, well, and cat. They constitute a household so long as the spouses are not divorced or separated, the children have not broken away, the mother-in-law has not quarreled with the son-in-law, the well has not become covered with scum, and the cat has not had kittens in the loft. If they stay in the house after that, then whether a water main is laid or the well is cleaned, it will not be a family but a settled plot, i.e., all the elements of animate and inanimate nature will remain in place, but the system of the family will disappear. If, on the contrary, the mother-in-law dies, the house is rebuilt, the cat runs away, the favorite son leaves to study, and so on, the family will be preserved in spite of the changes in the number of elements. That means that the objects are not the really substantial operative element of the system, but rather the connections are, although they have neither mass, charge, nor temperature. This interlink between separate people with mutual dissimilarity is a real manifestation of a systems link and cannot be defined by any other indicators. The relations in a system can be both positive and negative, some of the links of the subsystem being able to change sign during an individual's life. Let us continue my example. The relation of a newborn boy with elders has a certain tendency and weight, footnote 10. They take care of him, bring him up, and teach him. On becoming an adult, and the father of a family, he does not, however, break his relations with his elders. But the sign of the connection changes to its opposite. He cares for his parents and teaches his children. Finally, having become an old man, he again requires care and attention. This pattern indicates that no system is static, but is in mobile equilibrium, homeostasis, or in motion from a push of some kind whose impulse lies outside the system. It is not excluded, of course, that this impulse is limited for a system of higher rank, but the mechanism of influence is not altered. The family is a graphic example of a system, but more complicated systems, like for example an ethnos, social organism, species, geobiokinesis, are governed by the same regularity, even when allowance is being made for being constructed on a hierarchical principle, in which the subsystems form a systems entity or supersystem, and the supersystems a hypersystem, and so on. The existence of universal, general connections that create dynamic stereotypes is thus more or less stable, but never eternal. The degree of stability of an ethnos, as a system, is thus determined not by its mass, i.e. the size of the population, and the accuracy of its copying of ancestors, but by a mean statistical set of connections of various weights and signs. A sharp departure beyond definite limits entails either death or rapid development. The elasticity of an ethnos is created by that, which makes it possible to absorb and dampen external influences and sometimes even regenerate itself, because a multi-link system makes up for the damage from the reorganization of connections. Let me pass from this popular explanation to scientific definitions, i.e. cybernetics and systemology on the scale that we shall need them. System in ethnology. The American scientist Norbert Wiener defined cybernetics as the science of control and communication. The merit of cybernetics is the method of investigating complex systems, since it gives no advantages in the study of simple systems. The study of cybernetics is the modes of behavior of an object. It does not ask what is it, but rather, what does it do? Cybernetics is concerned with all forms of behavior, insofar as they are regular or determined or reproducible. Materiality is of no significance, nor observance or non-observance of the ordinary laws of physics. These theses cited indicate that for an ethnologist who interprets the essence of the phenomenon of ethnos and recognizes laws in order to tie his own observations up with them, absolute confidence in the method of cybernetics is counterindicated. Application of cybernetic methods can serve as a corrective for the extrapolation of empirical generalizations, but no more. Therefore, it is not the ideas of Wiener, but those of Bertalanffy, who combine physical chemistry and thermodynamics with cybernetics, that will usefully underlie the methods of system study of an ethnos. According to Bertalanffy's approach, footnote 11, a system is a complex of mutually interacting elements, i.e., the primary elements of information are the connections between facts and not the separate facts themselves. According to A. Malinowski, a system is built up from units whose grouping has interdependent significance, and from links, blocks, and subsystems, each of which is a unit of a lower order that provides the hierarchical principle that makes it possible to carry on investigation at a given level. Footnote 12. Starting from that principle, we have the right to treat an ethnos as a system of social and natural units and the elements inherent in them. An ethnos is not just a crowd of people similar in certain features to one another, but a system of individuals different in tastes and capabilities, and of the products of their activity, traditions, and geographical environment, ethnic surroundings, and tendencies to increase or diminish. The trend of development is particularly important because, quote, the general for all cases of sets is the property of elements to possess all forms of activity that lead to the formation of static or dynamic structures, unquote, footnote 13. The application of this approach to processes of ethnogenesis is also linked with the solution of the problem of historicism, since all the observed facts are built up into a dynamic system of historical development. It only remains for me to analyze that part of world history that is connected with my theme. We can thus define the real existence of an ethnic entity as the dynamic existence of a system that includes not only people, but also elements of landscape, cultural tradition, and relations with neighbors. Footnote 14. These are not only the biological system and not only the social one, because analogs of the biological and social levels are not justified. The original charge of energy in such a system is gradually expended, and entropy continually increases. A living substance or system must therefore constantly remove the accumulating entropy, exchanging energy and entropy with the environment. This exchange is controlled by regulating systems that employ the stocks of information transmitted by inheritance. In our case, the role of regulating systems is played by tradition, which interacts equally with the social and natural form of the motion of matter. Transmission of experience to progeny is observed in most warm-blooded animals, but the existence of tools, speech, and writing separates man from other mammals, and an ethnos is a form of collective being inherent only in man. Levels and types of ethnic systems. The approach I have adopted allows me to substitute ethnic systematics for ethnic classification. A classification can be made according to some arbitrary attribute, language, race, religion, kind of job, citizenship. In any case, it will be an arbitrary division not inherent in the nature of things. But systematics reflects precisely the latter, studying humanity and technique and domestic animals as a definite object. The biggest unit, after mankind as a whole, as an amorphous anthroposphere, one of the envelopes of Earth, is the superethnos, i.e., a group of ethnoi that has arisen at the same time in a region and which manifests itself in history as a mosaic unity of ethnoi, i.e., of directly observable taxa. They, in turn, are divided into sub-ethnoi, i.e., a unit that exists only because they are part of the unity of the ethnos. Without the ethnos, they fall to pieces and die. Membership of a category of taxonomy is determined not only by the absolute identity of the individuals, but by how far they are similar in a certain aspect at a given level. At the level of the superethnos, let us take the Middle Ages as an example. Muslims, composed of Arabs, Persians, Turkomans, Berbers, for instance, were closer to one another than the members of the West Christian superethnos, the Franks, as all the Catholics of Western Europe were called. On the other hand, the French, Castilians, and Scots were part of the general superethnos that were closer to one another than to members of the other superethnoi, Muslim, Orthodox, etc. At ethnos level, the French were closer to one another than to the English. That did not prevent the Burgundians from supporting Henry V and taking Joan of Arc prisoner, although they understood that they were going against their own. In any case, one must not reduce the whole variety of visible history to awareness of ethnic unity, which is only sometimes the main factor determining a person's behavior. But there is always such awareness, along with others, which provides for classing it as the nature of man, as an invariant rather than among variants of the historical process. In other words, however mosaic an ethnos is, and however varied its structure, it is a unity at a given level. It is very interesting that historians are already groping for the possibility of such an approach. They involuntarily group ethnoi into constructs that they call either cultures or civilizations or worlds. For the 12th and 13th centuries, for example, we find real sense in concepts that were then perceived as actually existing entities. Western Europe, for example, which was under the ideological suzerainty of the Pope and the formal, but never in fact realized, suzerainty of the German Emperor, called itself the Christian world. The West Europeans thereby counterposed themselves not only to the Muslims they were fighting in Spain and Palestine, but also to the Orthodox Greeks and Russians, and also, surprisingly, to the Irish and Welsh Celts. It is quite obviously, it was not a religious community that was understood by that, but a systems unity that was given its name by an arbitrarily accepted indicator. The world of Islam equally counterposed itself to the Greeks and Franks and the pagan Turks, but from the angle of religion it was not a unity. The doctrine of the Shiites, theists, Karamathians, atheists, and of the Sufis, pantheists, had very little resemblance to each other or to the orthodox doctrine of Islam, Sunnism. The Christian Europeans, too, were by no means friendly with one another, but when clashing with Muslims or pagans, they immediately found a common language and ways of compromise. That meant, for example, that Venetians could fight Genoese, but only until Arabs or Berber Muslims appeared, and then the former enemies threw themselves against the common enemy. We know from history that fierce wars were often waged between close relatives, but they differed radically from the wars at the level of major systems. In the latter case, the enemy was regarded as someone foreign, interfering, and liable to destruction, while personal motives, anger, hatred, envy, etc., were not a reason for the brutality exhibited. The further systems are from one another, the more cold-blooded the mutual extermination is, being converted into a kind of dangerous hunt. Can one really hate a tiger or crocodile? On the contrary, the struggle within a system has the aim of not exterminating the enemy, but of victory over him, since the system cannot exist without its component parts. The leader of the Florentine Ghibellines, Farinata degli Uberti, for instance, helped the enemies of his city win, but did not permit the destruction of Florence. He declared that he was fighting the city in order to live in it. He lived there until his death, after the Arbia ran red with the blood of his enemies, the Florentine Guelphs. But that was still nothing. The Venetians dealt far more severely with Albergo, the brother of the famous Ghibelline Eccelino da Romana. When he yielded up his castle near Treviso in 1260, 6 of his sons were killed before his eyes, and then he himself was beheaded, and his wife and 2 daughters burned alive on the square of Treviso. Why were such senseless cruelties inflicted? To understand the situation, one has to grasp that, quote, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines were algebraic signs that could conceal meaning, unquote, footnote 15. It is considered that the Ghibellines were feudalists and the Guelphs burghers, but a number of towns were half and half for the Ghibellines, and some Guelphs became Ghibellines, and vice versa. And it happened that the 2 parties acted together against the Arabs or Greeks. Such big urban republics as Genoa and Venice passed repeatedly from one camp to the other, guided only by political considerations. So why did blood flow? The means of maintaining unity of a system depends on the epoch, or rather on the phase of ethnogenesis. In young systems, the elements make very interesting contact, passionate, so to say, which causes clashes. The bloody discords often have neither ideological nor class sense, occurring within the limits of one social stratum, like the War of the Roses in England or the War of the Armagnacs and Burgundians in France. But these intestine wars manage to maintain the unity of the ethnic system and state better than when the population is apathetic, when it would seem easier to live, but the ethnoi break up and disappear as entities. Ethnic systems are often not equivalent to state formations. One ethnos may live in different states, or several in one. So in what sense can we treat them as systems? It is acceptable to divide systems into 2 ideal types, rigid and corpuscular, or discrete. In rigid systems, all the parts or elements are fitted to one another, so that their simultaneous existence is necessary for normal functioning. In discrete systems, the elements interact freely and easily replace analogous ones, without the system ceasing to work, and it is even possible to drop some elements with the next renewal. If that does not happen, there is a simplification of the system that may go so far as to destroy it. Another division of systems is possible, into open ones constantly receiving energy and exchanging positive and negative entropy with the environment, and closed ones that use up the original charge until their potential is balanced with that of the environment. 4 variants are possible when these 2 characteristics are compared. 1. Rigid open, 2. Rigid closed, 3. Discrete open, and 4. Discrete closed. The division is arbitrary because any operating system combines features of different types, but since it is close to one pole or the other, the division is justified in practice because it helps classify systems by the degree of subordination of the elements. When we study history, both constitutional, social, cultural, and ethnic, we come up against all the gradations of systems of the types described, with the exception of the extremes, i.e. only rigid or only discrete, because neither the one nor the other is viable. Rigid systems cannot be self-restorative when they break down, while discrete ones lack the capacity to withstand blows from the outside. We therefore encounter systems in practice with various degrees of rigidity, which is the higher, the more human labor involved in it, and the lower, the more creation of the system is initiated by natural processes that constantly transform the elements composing it. The limit is the opposition of the technosphere and the biosphere. But where's the boundary of the biosphere and the technosphere if the human organism itself is a part of nature? Obviously, the boundary of the socio-technosphere and the biosphere runs within human bodies as well as outside them. But the difference does not disappear because of that. On the contrary, we are seeking a real element of the interaction of the social and biological here. It is that independent and quite well-known phenomenon of nature, the ethnos. Ideally, an ethnos is a discrete system, but not so as to be annihilated by neighbors. It immediately develops social forms that are auxiliary rigid systems, the authority of the elders in the clan, for example, the chief in the hunt or war, obligations in regard to the family, and finally, the formation of a state. The rigid systems are thus socio-political formations like the state, tribal unions, clans, bodyguards, etc. The coincidence of systems of both types, i.e. of the ethnos and state or tribal unions, is not obligatory, although it seems natural. Recall the great empires of antiquity that united diverse ethnoi or medieval feudal splintering of ethnoi. A propensity to combine is as natural as one to coincide. The systems of both types are dynamic, i.e. they rise and fall in history. Homeostatic ethnic systems in which changes are connected only with external effects seem to be the exception. But one must not forget that homeostasis arises only after intense development, when the forces creating and driving the system run out. Statics should therefore be perceived as slow inertial motion with a limit, 0, that is not reached in practice. Sub-ethnoi, the structure of an ethnos. Its structure, an inseparable feature of an ethnos, is always more or less complex, but it is this complexity that gives it the stability by which it has a chance to survive centuries of confusion, troubles, and peaceful wasting away. The principle of ethnic structure is, one may say, a hierarchical subordination of ethnic subgroups, of sub-ethnic groups. The latter understood as taxonomic units within the ethnos, as a visible whole, and not disrupting its unity. At first glance, this thesis contradicts my proposition about the existence of an ethnos as an elementary entity. But remember that even a molecule of matter consists of atoms, and an atom of elementary particles, which does not ablate the statements about the entity at one level or another, molecular or atomic or even subatomic. The whole thing is a characteristic of structural connections. Let me explain this from an example. A Karelian from the Tver province called himself a Karelian in his village, but on going to study in Moscow, a Russian, because it made sense in the village to counterpose Karelians to Russians, but in the city it did not, since the way of life and culture were so differences of way in life and culture were so insignificant as to not be visible. But if he were a Tatar rather than a Karelian, he would go on calling himself a Tatar, because the past religious differences deepened his ethnographic dissimilarity from the Russians. But a Tatar living in Western Europe or China would be considered a Russian, and would himself agree with that. In New Guinea, however, he would be seen as a European, and not of the tribe of the English or Dutch. This example is very important for ethnic diagnosis, and so for demographic statistics and ethnographic maps. For when such maps are being compiled, it is absolutely necessary to agree on the order and degree of approximation. Otherwise, it will be impossible to distinguish the sub-ethnoi that exist as elements of the structure of an ethnos from current ethnoi. Now let me touch on the subordination of ethnoi. The French, for example, a clear example of a monolithic ethnos, include, as I have already said, Breton Celts, Gascons of Basque origin, Alsatians, descendants of Alemanni, and Provençal, an independent people of the Romance group. In the 9th century AD, when ethnic names were first recorded in documents, the French, all the peoples named above, and others too, Burgundians, Normans, Aquitaine, and Savoyards, did not constitute a single ethnos, and only after a 1,000-year process of ethnogenesis was the ethnos formed that we call the French. The merging, however, did not cause a leveling of local customs, rituals, etc. They were maintained as provincial peculiarities that did not disrupt the ethnic wholeness of the French. We see the results of ethnic integration particularly clearly in France, because the course of events during the Reformation led to the French Huguenots being forced to quit their homeland in the 17th century to save their lives. In doing so, they lost their former ethnic affiliation and became German nobles, Dutch burghers, and a large number of the Boers who colonized South Africa. The French ethnos shed them like a superfluous element of the structure, diverse even without it. France, as a socio-political entity, however, was not weakened, but on the contrary, consolidated. The fields and orchard, abandoned by the zealous Huguenots, passed to indifferent people who restored an economy in the 18th century that no longer suffered from internal wars. The ethnic monolithism arising enabled Napoleon to mobilize the population and create a very numerous and obedient army, after whose defeat France did not break up, in spite of all the survivals of provincial separatism. Self-regulation of the ethnos. It may seem strange that I ascribe a capacity for self-regulation to an ethnos, but an ethnos is dynamic in historical development and consequently, like any long-lasting process, finds solutions within its power to maintain its existence. Others are cut off by selection and die out. All living systems resist extinction, i.e. are anti-entropic, and adapt to external conditions insofar as that is possible. But as soon as some complexity of structure raises the resistance of an ethnos to external blows, it is not surprising that where it was not sufficiently mosaic at birth, as for example in Great Russia in the 14th and 15th centuries, it begins to throw up subethnic formations that sometimes take shape as estates. Footnote 16. On the southern borders, Cossacks emerged. In the north, Pomors. Footnote 17. Subsequently, they were augmented by prospectors, at first glance simply a kind of job. Footnote 18. Peasants followed after them, mixing with the aborigines of Siberia and forming a subethnos of Siberians. In the course of history, these subethnic groups dissolved into the main mass of the ethnos, but at the same time, new ones were thrown up. It is very easy to distinguish subethnoi because the ethnography of the end of the 19th century worked precisely at that level. Russian ethnographers studied everyday customs, i.e., a fixed stereotype of the behavior of a group of population that differed sharply from those of the capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg. They studied the life of the Olonets peasants in Karelia, for example, but not of the professors of the colleges of St. Petersburg. In short, subethnoi are obvious because on one hand they are within an ethnos, and on the other, their bearers differ from all others in manners, mode of expression of feelings, and so on. They arise through different causes, coincide sometimes with estates, but never with classes, and disperse relatively painlessly, giving way to others, outwardly dissimilar, but with the same functions and fates. The purpose of these subethnic formations is to support ethnic unity by way of internal, non-antagonistic resistance. This complexity is obviously an organic detail of the mechanism of the ethnic system, and as such, arises in the very process of the formation of an ethnos or of an ethnogenesis. When an ethnic system is simplified in the phase of decay, the number of subethnoi is reduced to one. This marks the persistent or residual state of the ethnos. But what is the mechanism of the rise of subethnoi? To answer that, we have to go to a lower order, in which there are taxonomic units that I divide into two sections, consortia and convicinities. Small tribes, clans, and the already mentioned corporations, local groups, and other associations of people are put into these sections. Consortia and convicinities. Let us agree on terms. I call groups of people united by a common historical fate consortia. They include circles, cooperatives and workers' guilds, sects, bands, and similar unstable associations. They usually break up, but sometimes last for several generations. Then they become convicinities, i.e. groups of people both with a way of life of the same character and family connections. They are not very resistant. They are eaten away by exogamy and reshuffled by succession, i.e. by sharp changes of historical surroundings. Undamaged convicinities grow into subethnoi. Such were the Russian prospectors mentioned above, consortia of desperate, foolhardy explorers who gave rise to a generation of staunch Siberians and Old Believers. The first English colonies in America were founded by consortia and were converted into convicinities. New England was founded by Puritans, Massachusetts by Baptists, Pennsylvania by Quakers, Maryland by Catholics, Virginia by Royalists, Georgia by supporters of the House of Hanover. Consortia sailed from England that were not reconciled either to Cromwell or to the Stuarts, and on the new soil, where the old disputes were not pressing, they became convicinities that opposed themselves to new neighbors, Indians and French. The Russian prospectors and Old Believers remained a part of their ethnos, but the descendants of the Spanish conquistadors and English Puritans formed special ethnoi in America, so this level can be considered the limit of ethnic divergence. And, one must note, the oldest tribes were obviously formed in former times by this means. An original consortium of energetic people is converted into an ethnos in conditions of isolation, which in early epochs we call a tribe. Ethnology finishes with consortia at the ordinal level, but the principle of hierarchical subordination can operate even further if necessary. At a lower level, we get the single individual, connected with his surroundings. That can be useful for the biography of great men. Going down further, we encounter not the full biography of the person, but an episode of his life, for example, a crime committed that should be disclosed, and even lower, chance emotion, which does not entail major consequences. But we have to remember that this endless dividing, which is in the nature of things, does not remove the need to find a unity at a given level, important for tackling the task posed.